New research from Pew confirms that Americans on the far ends of the political ideology spectrum are most engaged in national politics. A whopping 85% of both faith and flag conservatives and the progressive left voted in 2020. For reference, only 68% of the general public voted then. The most ideologically extreme are also most likely to contribute money to a political campaign and attend an in-person or virtual political rally. We've got Team Rising here to weigh in on that. Colin Rogero is a Democratic strategist, and Rena Shaw is a former Republican strategist and advisor to the Renew Democracy Initiative. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.
So, Colin, has this been your experience in organizing that, the most engaged, the most interested, the most active, their views are, well, in the Democratic coalition, right, much further to the left than the average Democrat?
Yeah, and you used an important word there, which is Democratic coalition. So there's a lot of different portions of that progressive left that have different issues that are very important to them. So yes, and I think like any particular interests, the ones who are the most active and the most motivated are the ones that are loudest and the most engaged and working the hardest. But that is not what elections are built on. Yes, 85% of those people on both sides of the spectrum voted, but it's not the vast majority of voters, as that same study points out. What we have to do a better job of is making sure that we engage and talk in the language and about the issues that larger portion of America actually cares about, so that it's not all about the stuff that's on the extremes of both right and left, because most people, quite frankly, aren't there.
Right.
And so, Rena, the most energetic and enthusiastic Trump supporters seem like over the past 4 or 5 years have only gotten kind of more enthusiastic, and that things have kind of, the things that have unfolded over the last several years have kind of just further fueled the anger that drove them in the first place. Whereas on the Democratic side, if you think of the Women's March, type of Democrats who really fueled the resistance, fueled the 2018 takeover, helped Biden beat Trump in 2020, a lot of the things that have gotten them activated are dissipating, in the sense that in the suburbs, a lot of parents are furious about how things have gone with school closures and schools. COVID became this big culture war, but now on the right, the culture war still rages, whereas on the left, now they're getting pretty frustrated at Biden's response to COVID. And so I'm wondering and I'm curious, Colin, too, if you're sensing kind of an asymmetric enthusiasm at this point.
I would say on both ends, on the furthest ends of the political spectrum, aren't they both raging against a machine, like, so to speak? I would say where we are right now is a particularly ugly place because of the fact that we've allowed our national dialogue to be controlled by the fringe. And we've allowed that by really incentivizing. I mean, there's definitely a monetary component here that incentivizes some of these loudest, most fringe voices to benefit, frankly, create their own platforms and earn money. This is the era we're in. This is our reality. These right-wing personalities are not just living on Twitter. They're complaining on that very same platform while also going on other platforms and trying to build those. I mean, we've all heard of Getter and Parler and Gab. Everybody's trying to go somewhere different. But the reality is that wherever they go, they will continue to say the very same things. What are those things? Is anyone even paying attention? And I think what we know from a year ago is, we need to pay attention to a lot of the stuff they're saying, because now we're in a violent place. I think that's how we quickly got to a place that just felt so it couldn't happen in America, because we see the incentives tied here. So, Ryan, how do we push back on this? I don't know. I mean, we see here in this Pew Research study that the most prolific political tweeters report more civic engagement and appear more politically polarized. Real life isn't on Twitter, though. I mean, the average person out there isn't looking at their favorite person on Twitter. They're sort of looking at them wherever they see them, some media outlet, and then moving on with their life. So what does it even really mean in the grand scheme of things? I don't think very much. I mean, Andrew Yang can tell you elections aren't won on Twitter either. So for real life, I think this study, while it's good and sheds light on a lot of what's happening on social media platforms, I just don't see that it tells us anything we need to know in order to move the needle and change the discourse, the discourse that has become so very ugly and feels like stuck in a place of just not even agreeing to disagree. And that to me was how I was raised. I would assume that Colin grew up in an era also where it felt like, it was just super American to walk into the public square and say, hey, I feel this way about something, somebody else being like, okay, that's okay, and moving on. Now it's like people are afraid of being canceled. People are afraid of even taking their voices into the public square. To me, that's a greater danger for our democracy.
When I think, and there's, extreme in terms of behavior and sort of tone or theatrics that where how you treat other people, where I think being extreme is bad and unhealthy and wrong. But in terms of the actual views, there are like views that some people would characterize as extreme that I agree with, and probably you too, Ryan. Right? It's not you're a very progressive person. Your views on those issues are outside to some extent of the mainstream, but that doesn't mean you think they're wrong.
For now, right? Yeah.
Well, right. We're trying to push people toward, unless you are like a genuinely, like I think of myself as sort of centrist or moderate in terms of tone, but not in terms of the ideas that I hold. And so I thought the poll was a little weird and like frowning on or not separating those kinds of things. I don't know, what do you think, Colin?
Yeah, but we're missing, and I would just say, Ryan, to your previous question, asymmetric motivation is normal when you are the party that's out of power. Right. It's normal in elections for it to be that way. For instance, nobody wanted to vote in 2010 and because basically everybody was like, well, Obama's in there, he'll take care of it, it's fine.
Right.
And Democrats have that typical behavior. It's how we behave. It's one of the challenges of running campaigns. So I think that there's some normalcy to that. I would say, Ryan, that there's a separate point that you bring up that is important. And that point is that, yes, we have held differing views, and there has been a lot of space between those differing views before. But the government has always found a way to make it towards the center and negotiate some way for us to move forward, right? Congress has worked through these mechanics. The presidency has worked through these mechanics to get us into a place where something happens. We don't have that anymore. That's actually not happening right now. Right now, people are just divided, and it's getting passed on one side or it's getting passed on the other, depending on who's in power. And that's not functional as we move forward. That's what has to change.
Right, and it's for the Democrats' big agenda items, it's not even getting passed at all.
Sure.
Which then goes to your further point of the asymmetric enthusiasm being exacerbated by not only being out of power, but not only being in power, which then disincentivizes people from engagement, which is counterintuitive, but is it's how people behave. But then if you see that Democrats aren't actually doing anything, they're like, well, what's this for anyway? And if you look at
Democrats always try to argue, though, that they need more. It's because we don't have enough.
They try to argue that,
right? But it's not. It doesn't convince people.
Right. And if you look at media consumption, New York Times, CNN, even Fox, like everybody, like just way down. And we're going to talk with Batya about that later. Are you guys seeing that in your own kind of political universe, that it's just harder to get engagement with voters?
I have not seen that particular thing. I have not seen that, to be honest. I'm seeing greater things like trust in institutions. Like, I just do not trust these elected leaders to do this for me. Like, you're asking me to give, for example, but I don't want to give. I'll show up at the polls, but I don't want to give at the rate I used to give because I don't trust anymore. So to me, that the backslide, of democracy, things like that are contributors because people just don't trust the institutions. And then we see norms like that eroded. Like, we've known on Capitol Hill forever. It took both sides coming to the middle and getting something done. But exactly what Colin highlighted is this norm sort of being upended. And that also changes voter behavior. But I don't know that we've seen it so quick yet. Obviously, this midterm election will tell us in 2022.
Yeah, in campaigns, it's increasingly harder to reach everyone. It's increasingly harder to communicate, and it's increasingly harder to deliver messages that people actually believe. Because majority of the people who receive any political messaging just say, I don't believe that because it is political messaging, whether it's wrong, whether it's true, whether it's actually something that they would benefit from. It's very, very difficult to get people to believe any of these things anymore. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge for campaigns. That's a challenge for the media. That's a challenge for politics and the country in general. We have to figure out what we're going to do about that as we move forward.
Politics is bad, and people should avoid it, maybe. I don't know. Colin, Rena, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.